Hello everybody, and welcome to the presentation on Kant's Deontology. We will spend 2 modules covering Kant. There are 3 presentations in this module. This is the first part of this week's presentation, and it is broken up into 2 parts. Then there is a third part covering objections to deontology. Deontology, by the way, is a theory of ethics that is based on the concept of following or doing one's moral duty, but in a very specific way. Since Kant is one of the most difficult philosophers we will cover, it might be beneficial to prepare ourselves for what is to come. 2 of the reasons Kant is difficult is because of his writing style and because he is translated from German. Once you start to get a hold of the concepts, though, the rest should come easier, so you shouldn't let the initial difficulty psych you out. The translation isn't too big of an issue from a secondary source such as Rachel's, but this lecture will go into a bit more detail than Rachel's does. One of the first things to understand about Kant's deontology is that it stands in stark contrast to consequentialist theories like utilitarianism. Here is a useful set of contrasts between utilitarianism, which we have already covered, and Kant's deontology. Kant was largely responding to the popularity of utilitarianism, a theory which he was very much opposed to. Here we will look at a few points side by side. For utilitarians, consequences are the only things that matter morally, specifically pleasure and pain for hedonistic act utilitarianism. But for deontology, consequences do not have any moral significance at all, literally none at all. Only the goodwill, which we will explain later, matters morally. For utilitarians, you will recall, the morality of a decision or action is based on consequences, and so the right thing to do may be different in different circumstances. But for Kantians or deontologists, the morality of a decision or act is based on reason alone, and is tested by compatibility with what is known as the categorical imperative, which we will discuss later. If an action is wrong, therefore, it is always wrong, because it is always contrary to reason. For utilitarians, deciding what is right and wrong requires empirical study. For example, remember the case of trying to decide if a utilitarian would support the death penalty or not will largely depend on whether or not the death penalty is effective at deterring crime. For Kantians or deontologists, since consequences have no moral value at all, under this theory, empirical research into consequences or the effects of certain policies is irrelevant. Once again, we will be using the anatomy of an ethical theory to break down this ethical theory into its component parts. If you recall, nearly every ethical theory has, first, a concept of the good. Then, to be philosophical, it needs a reason or justification for this conception. The second part of the theory is a method for achieving or doing or being good. And again, this method requires a justification. Sometimes this is very straightforward, and sometimes not. So, here is how the anatomy of an ethical theory breaks down for Kant's deontology. The conception of the good, according to deontology, the only morally good thing is the goodwill. Other possible candidates for the good are good only for other ends, or the result of chance, or actually lead to evil if misused. We will discuss this more in just a couple slides. The second part is the method. The method to be good is to use what is known as the categorical imperative to test the motives or rules that govern your actions. We will explain what the categorical imperative is later and specifically discuss 2 major formulations of it. The justification for this is that following the moral law is a universal command of reason. Violating the categorical imperative is thought to violate one's reason itself. And an important note here, for Kant the good will is entirely the rational will, the will that conforms to reason. As with utilitarianism, I'd like to introduce Kant's theory with a thought experiment to get at the basic intuition behind non-consequentialism. You should be warned, however, that this thought experiment will just give you the idea behind why one might think that consequences are not what is important morally. It will not directly lead you to Kant's entire theory. That said, imagine the following. Imagine that Jessica is a lifeguard at a local swimming pool. She is in training for the Olympics and is an excellent swimmer and very good at her job. She also has very good eyes, and even in a pool filled with more than 100 people in front of her who are causing chaos of 100 different kinds, she notices that an infant seems to have been left alone in the water. Indeed, the infant is too small to have been even allowed in the pool in the first place. As soon as she notices this, she springs into action. Unfortunately, by the time she gets there, the infant has already slid under the water, and none of those standing by seem to have noticed. She shoves a few people aside and pulls the infant from the water. Being not only certified in CPR, but one of the top students in her class, Jessica lays the infant out on a nearby towel and checks for breathing, and then for a heartbeat. The conditions to detect such things are not ideal, but to the best of her ability, she is unable to detect whether the infant has a beating heart or is breathing. Desperate to save the child, her CPR training kicks into action. She breathes for the infant, putting her mouth over both the infant's nose and mouth as she is supposed to, and she applies repeated rhythmic pressure to the heart, using only 2 fingers, being as careful as she can, knowing that the ribs of the infant can break extremely easily. The infant continues to show no sign of breath, and so Jessica increases the force she puts into CPR until 911 is finally called and an ambulance arrives. The paramedics whisk the infant away, and the infant is pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. A later autopsy shows that not only did Jessica fail to save the infant, the cause of death was a lung which had been pierced by a rib during the CPR process. It is also discovered that the infant suffered from a rare condition that caused her breathing to become extremely shallow and her heartbeat to become almost undetectable. Perhaps, if Jessica had been equipped with a doctor's stethoscope, she could have heard a shallow heartbeat, but this is not the kind of gear typically given to a swimming pool lifeguard. Given the baby's condition and the noisy and windy surroundings at the swimming pool, the doctor in charge concludes that there would likely have been no visible signs of breathing or a heartbeat strong enough for Jessica to have detected. Do you think that Jessica should be prosecuted for murder? Should she be prosecuted for involuntary manslaughter? Should she be prosecuted for a crime at all? Or should she, in fact, be praised for her good motives? When I've asked this question in my real-time classes, the response is overwhelmingly that Jessica should not be charged with a crime, and often that she should even be praised for a good character. On very rare occasions, students would say that she should be charged with involuntary manslaughter. Of course, the popularity of an opinion does not make an opinion correct. It is worth asking yourself what you think. The purpose of this thought experiment is to get at your intuitions. The general intuition of most people seems to be that moral motivation can trump outcome or consequences in terms of what is morally important. The intuition here is that consequences are largely out of our control. Assuming that free will exists, you are in control of your will. Indeed, it is the only thing that you are in control over. But anything could happen between your will and the result to interfere with the actual consequences. For example, you may will your arm to move to shake somebody's hand, but accidentally trigger a rare kind of muscle spasm in your arm that causes you to accidentally elbow somebody standing next to you in the face. The Kantian would say that, in spite of the bad consequences, you were not really responsible for the elbowing. It wasn't part of your free will or your decision. But be careful not to take this intuition too far, however, or you might deviate from Kant's theory. For Kant, it is the will that is important, but what is important is that it is the rational will. This is the will that follows the categorical imperative. It is not enough just to have one's heart in the right place, so to speak. For Kant, the good will is not just meaning well, as Jessica, the lifeguard in our example, might have meant well. Since we didn't fully examine her motivations, we cannot know yet whether she acted morally from a Kantian perspective. The point of this example was to help you see the intuition behind non-consequentialist theories like Kant's. The consequences don't matter for Kant, but the person must be reasoning in the correct way to be moral under Kant's theory. At this point, one might wonder about some of the other candidates for the good that Kant rejects. Kant does not believe that happiness can qualify as the good because he believes that the good will is a requirement for us to think that somebody deserves to be happy. In other words, he thinks it is a bad thing for people with a bad will to be happy, while a utilitarian would say that the more happiness in the world, the better. So imagine 2 worlds, exactly the same, except that in one, a cold-blooded murderer sitting in jail is happy, and in another, he is sad. Kant would say that the extra happiness in the first world is actually a bad thing, since the murderer has a bad will and does not deserve happiness. This would go for both the utilitarian concept of happiness and the more holistic concept of happiness of virtue ethics that we will be talking about when we discuss that theory. Likewise, he does not think that virtues are good in and of themselves. While we have not yet discussed virtue ethics, it is enough to note that the virtues are excellences of character that are usually useful. Thus he thinks that if somebody has a bad will, it is actually harmful for them to have such virtuous character traits, such as courage. For example, he might say that a courageous thief would be worse than one who is too cowardly to steal, or so foolhardy that she or he is easily caught. So, why is reason so important for Kant? Reason is necessary in order to have concepts at all. Thus, reason is necessary in order to even have a concept of a moral law. Since, under Kant's moral theory, the right reason for acting is out of a duty to the moral law, only rational beings can have direct moral value. Kant says that his morality should apply to all possible rational beings. He believes that it is a feature of reason itself. Kant is really trying to do something quite remarkable here. By basing his entire theory off reason alone, he is trying to prove his principles of morality in the same way that one might try to prove that 2 + 3 = 5. That is to say, on purely rational grounds. Now a bit about the way Kant uses the term persons or people. The term persons or people should be understood to mean rational beings as opposed to merely meaning human beings. Remember that Kant's theory is meant to apply to all rational beings no matter where or when they are. Some human beings might not be capable of reason. Somebody in a permanent coma would be an example of this. Likewise, it is theoretically possible that there are other rational beings that are not human. These too would count as persons in the moral sense for Kant. All this can have some rather counterintuitive results. Since the good will, the rational will, is all that will be morally important for Kant, this leads to some strange results for his theory when compared to many other ethical theories. For example, as we already pointed out, consequences are completely unimportant for Kant. You do the morally right thing regardless of what may result from it. Also, being guided by emotions or even empathy when making ethical decisions is not a good thing for Kant. For Kant, we should always follow our rational moral duty, and, if anything, strong emotions could get in the way of acting for the right reasons. For example, doing the right thing, such as giving to charity, because one feels sorry for somebody, as opposed to doing it because it is one's rational duty, is not morally good for Kant. One is not acting for the right moral reasons. Remember that deontology is the ethics of duty, acting for the sake of the moral law. Remember that for Kant, we've already covered a lot of ground so far, so before we continue, it might be a good idea to recap what we have covered. The good, rational will, is the ultimate good. This will belongs to persons, rational beings, only, and so persons contain the ultimate good, and everything else only gains goodness through them. Consequences of actions, therefore, do not matter at all for moral evaluation. Only the condition of the will, willing the correct moral way, matters. The way to be good is to follow one's rational duty, which can be understood through the categorical imperative, which we have not yet discussed. So far, we have covered the basic motivation for non-consequentialist theories in general, and given some of Kant's terminology and reasoning, as well as the general anatomy of his theory. In the next presentation, we will discuss the categorical imperative and see how it is used to test moral maxims. A maxim is a guiding rule or principle. You should become familiar with this term.